Thank you. That was very helpful for, I think, framing this conversation. The first question that we have for you all is, what areas of St. Paul schools do you personally think are the most critical but aren't being sufficiently funded? And I'm sure there's a lot, but if one comes to mind, or if a couple.
Well, I would say that this is across the country. We're totally, by the state and by the feds, totally underfunded in special education, which is a huge, expensive, necessary thing to do. But it's always a struggle for the district and the schools to make sure that we cover the federal rules, which are in many cases onerous from an administrative perspective. So there's all kinds of unfunded mandates. You're going to hear that a lot. And so I think that's a huge issue for us. You know, for instance, I get $500,000 of federal money because we're a Title I school. That pays for 5 teachers. But I bet you that 80% of our bureaucratic time that we spend doing bureaucracy is about that $500,000 out of a $12 million budget. So they're saying, well, you get this for this group of kids or whatever, but it's totally underfunded. So just in terms of money.
Absolutely. I think underfunded mandates, and not only in special education, but English language learners, disproportionately hit the urban core, where refugee communities have settled, where we have large English language learner populations, but also the disproportionality in special ed referrals in our Black and brown students drives up our special ed costs, but the federal government doesn't fund it. They fund it at 15% when they're supposed to fund it at 40%, which means we as a state, and the state doesn't fund it either, so we as a district have to take out our money that would go to non-special ed students, non-EL students, the general fund money to pay for more teachers, to pay for budgets, supplies, to cover the cost of these services, which they absolutely should be getting, but it's just costly.
You said they're funding it at 15 when they're supposed to be at 40. Why the discrepancy?
So when they passed, so when the special ed education law was passed in the 1940s, or in the 1970s, they just wrote down a number of 40%, but there's no mechanism that forces them to fund it at 40%. And so they just choose to fund it at 15%, and there's never been the political will to fund the extra $25 billion to special ed children.
So I got one other thing I could add that I always like to talk to people about is because I don't even know if this is a budget question. It's a way the budget is figured out question. And I don't even know what the Federation would say about this. But I think that one of our big issues is that we have this yearly budget cycle, which is completely insane administratively. So every year I have to go to my young teachers and say, oh, I might have to lay you off. Every year. And I'm trying to recruit young teachers and teachers of color to stay with us. And it makes absolutely no sense for them to stay with us if we lay them off every year.
Right.
And so I would and I don't know how it worked, but I think there should be a 4-year budget cycle. So we'd be arguing about budgets every 4 years. So I could go to and tell me what my budget's going to be for 4 years with some things about enrollment. So I could go to teachers, and I just think this is a huge problem that as a principal, I was like, man, that is such a hassle. And I can't guarantee, because I want these teachers to get tenure, these young teachers, because then they could change the system from inside. Anyway, that's not really a budget question, but.
Well, I wonder though too, how much of it is related to the way in which we fund public education, right? So we have to rely on levies every other year.
Right.
You know, and if we just went ahead and said we will fully fund, which is what Education Minnesota is asking for, to the tune of $4.3 or $5 billion.
It's at $7 billion.
Is that $7 billion? Well, we're not. Then we're asking for maybe half of that at $4.3 billion. We're asking for 7.
Yeah.
Oh, I missed that. Sorry. I missed that. But anyway, you know, if you fund it by tax dollars, I wonder if that doesn't have anything to do with with the funding cycle, I don't know, but it's not a good way to fund public education.
Yes, funding, using local dollars to fund, local communities to fund their schools is a disaster. And that's here and in rural Minnesota. Rural Minnesota gets particularly hit hard because farmland is exempt from property taxes. So large farms don't pay into the education system. And so here in Minnesota, or in the cities, right, our referendums are a couple $100 on a house, maybe property taxes is $1,800 that goes to the schools. In Bemidji, it's $128. And so rural Minnesota gets crushed by having local property taxes fund their schools.
And then we're pitted against rural Minnesota. So even in Education Minnesota, we have members who are from greater Minnesota who say, well, why is it that the cities get everything, So it ekes away at our solidarity. But then here we have the tax increment financing. So help me out, because I may not be able to get this, TIFs. So for example, in Bloomington, we have the Mall of America. And the Mall of America is a TIF, a giant TIF, and their agreement actually runs out this year. However, they have asked to be able to take whatever money they would owe and put it into another special fund. I think it's to the tune of about $500 million maybe. And they're going to use it to build a parking lot.
A water park.
A water park, and is it 200 million? While Bloomington Public Schools, which is right in their district, just made millions of dollars of cuts, and they laid off a ton of educators. They laid off media specialists. They no longer have world languages in middle school, and they're, even as they suffer the cuts, you have the trauma of being an educator working next door to somebody, and then they're laid off, right? And so it's almost like survivor guilt, because maybe your area is not cut, but you're next door to the Spanish teacher who loses their job. So financing is
I don't have all the financing background exactly. I know a lot of it from my work, but to go to the question about the funding of where it should go, I worked in early elementary, and I left a pre-K position, and it goes right along with what you're asking for in this bargaining round, which is the mental health needs of my students were incredible. I worked in the school that had the highest homelessness rate, the highest asthma rate, and chronic illness like that leads to a lot of absences and a lot of unmanaged chronic illnesses can be really difficult. So when you don't have, we did have a nurse that was cut to 4 days from 5 days, and then you had office staff filling in, right? So they aren't experts. I literally carried a child from recess who couldn't breathe, ran in my arms, and it just makes me want to cry, because my own child has severe allergies. He's had a reaction, and he's had to have an EpiPen and be rushed to the hospital, and I'm nervous about sending him to a school without a full-time nurse where his siblings go, right? So I take the mental health and the wraparound services that the community service model, the community school model, of just having those things for families and for students, it made a world of difference when I had some of those things available to me and my students. And I think that's where we should put a lot of our funding.
When I left, they had a really big uptake in 504 plans, which is not quite an individualized education plan, IEPs, where you would have a special ed teacher that would kind of manage your coursework. But we had a huge uptick across the board for students across the board, right? It didn't matter ethnic background, it didn't matter what economic background they came from, and I don't know how it is at Johnson, but a lot of anxiety. A lot of anxiety, and I think that I agree about the wraparound services, is that if we had that, then we would be able to better serve the needs of our students.